Hello, welcome to week 11, and we're talking about land degradation. Or, let me put that back a little bit. I'm sorry. Alright, hi everybody. Week 11. Today we're talking about land degradation, and I have the joke, all we are is dust in the wind, because in large part, this focuses on desertification. So, land degradation. Let's kind of do some historical background here. Um, Around the year 800 AD, in the desert southwest here, so Arizona, New Mexico, this area, this Native American culture arose. And Native Americans that had been living in small villages and farming all of a sudden started to build these relatively large villages and cities, decent sized. And there was a noticed uptake in their culture and their trade with nearby Native Americans. They were trading as far south as Mexico and Guatemala and as far east as the Atlantic Ocean. But right around the year 1000, give or take, we noticed that their villages stopped being out in the open near their farm fields and start being built in areas near cliffs and in the mountain valleys where they could hide or pull up the ladders and people could not get in. And their cities go from being these beautiful wide open cities to these kind of small, very easily defensible locations. And then later, about the year 1300, we see no further evidence of large cities at all. In fact, we think that what happened was they disbanded and started living again as small farmers, small villages. And so when the Spanish came through in the 15 and 1600s, the people they encountered were no longer living in cities. We call these the Anasazi, which is the Native American term for the forgotten ones or the ancient ones. And we think what happened, the reason that we saw all these changes was their environment. Something changed that allowed them to grow a lot more food about the year 800. And so they grew more food, their population swelled, and they had more people to do and make goods and trade. But something happened also about the year 1000 that made them harder to farm. And we think what happened, looking at other records, is that the entire area of the West here enters a severe period of drought, where basically for the next 2 to 300 years it rains less and less every year, to the point where they couldn't grow enough food to feed their large cities. And if people can't be fed, well, as you can see what happens even today, people panic or start changing the way they live, and this eventually causes their civilization to collapse. And in large part, this is land degradation. The natural ecosystem dried up, which provided them with less water. But in addition, the way they farmed didn't work well, and it made the land less able to provide. So, in a sense, nature and people kind of work together to degrade the land. And that's what land degradation is. It's actions that cause the reduction and loss of biodiversity, or the amount of living things available, such as a forest after a fire, where the trees being cut down. But it also makes the land less economically productive. So if you have a forest and you do something to get rid of the trees, what's left doesn't produce as many trees, and therefore not as much money. If you're a farmer and something happens to make your farm fields grow less corn, right, that's economic loss as well. Now, any area can be degraded, and we talk about forest, right? You can cut the forest down for various reasons. And this can also be for natural actions such as drought or forest fire, and it can be man made, anthropogenic. A lot of times people cut down the forest for trees or for other uses. Good example here is the Canadian tar sands. Now, this area here, beautiful, up in northern Canada, very rugged, very little people. But underneath the trees, the soil here is sandy, and it has just tons of oil in it. Tar sand. It's literally just sandy dirt. Now, the reason that this is a big deal now is because we still want oil for our economy, and people are willing to pay more. We've always known that there's been oil in the sand, but you basically have to boil it or cook it to get the oil out. It's very expensive, and it costs a lot of money. But if gas costs more per gallon, it's affordable, and they go through and they basically gouge off the surface and just cook it up. So this is obviously a much more degraded landscape. But the big thing we're going to focus on is desertification. And desertification is just that, turning lands into deserts. So you can see right here that there's actually a desert on one side of this fence, open sand and dirt, very much a vibrant grassland here. So degradation can cause huge factors, but it has many things that contribute to it. And a lot of times it's not just natural and it's not just man-made. It's this intermix. So when we're talking about desertification, this flowchart is just saying what are the things that lead to it. And these are the human factors that lead to desertification, and we'll talk about these in detail. But there's also climatological factors. Obviously, if the rainfall stops or changes, that's part of it as well. But the way that we interact with that can cause it. And just conversely, climatological factors can decrease desertification, the rainfall increases, but also human factors can also do that. So it can go both ways. So let's talk about some of the causes of degradation. A lot of it has to do with population. If a population increases, you need more land to grow food, you need more food, or you have to grow food more intensely on the land you have. Also, as population increases, we need more places for people to live. So neighborhoods, and so places for people to shop, stores. And so one thing that will happen is areas that are left in a wild state like forests or grasslands are turned into farm fields or shopping malls. And that can always, it doesn't always have to be bad, but sometimes what happens is the reason that these areas were not being used for anything is that they weren't really good at being farm fields, or they weren't really good at being shopping malls. Maybe it flooded, or maybe it was hot and dry. And so as population increases, it pushes people to use land that they would not normally have. Another thing is poor agricultural practices. If you grow crops in a way that doesn't replenish the soil, it makes it harder to grow crops the next year. Some plants need a lot of fertilizer and a lot of work. And what happens is, after a few years, those soils just worn out. It can't grow anymore. Or the way you actually use the land, like overgrazing. If you have too many cows or sheep, they eat the grass down to the roots. And what happens is, as we'll learn, if there's lack of grass or a very strong cover, it exposes the dirt and the soil to wind and water, and that can lead to desertification as well. Deforestation is another one. Obviously, if people are cutting down trees, that changes the environment, and sometimes that's made in a sustainable way, but a lot of times it goes hand in hand with bad government. In other words, governments aren't necessarily looking at the long-term usage or the long-term sustainability. So here in Brazil, right, there is so much rainforest that the government does not think much of letting people clear acres to grow crops. The problem is that this is happening on a continued scale, and over time, the cumulative loss of forest can be very hard on the environment. Secondly, the soil here in the rainforest in Brazil is not really good for growing much else than trees. So the first year they'll cut down the trees, they might grow a good crop, but within 3 or 4 years, the soil is worn out and not very useful. Poverty is another factor, and poverty kind of connects to a lot of other things. Farmers that are poor, or people that are poor, are going to farm areas that maybe should not be farmed because they don't have a choice. As a population expands and you have more people and people are poor and hungry, they are going to do whatever they can in the short term to eat. So if that means farming on soil that's not really good soil or growing a crop that maybe might not last, they'll do that. The problem is, with poverty, you don't have a lot of choice. And secondly, you don't have a lot of options as to how you manage the land. Colonialism. This is an actual, pretty much a poster. In the United States, we pretty much sold Native American land, to settlers. And the whole practice was we wanted to remove the land from Indian usage and make it for white settlers. Well, the problem is, we'll talk about the Dust Bowl, is a lot of the areas where Native Americans were really wasn't suited for white agriculture. In other words, the Great Prairies of the United States, like Nebraska and Kansas and Oklahoma, were suited to be grasslands better used for maybe grazing cattle or letting bison run, not so much for farming. But we didn't really do that. And so what happens is we basically import a style of agriculture that is not supported by the land. Globalization can also drive this. This right here is a picture of Indonesia. Indonesia has some of the largest rainforests in the world, but they're cutting it down in large method, and they're actually growing palm trees. They're cutting down the natural forest here. And these green rows you see are just palm trees. The problem with that is it's only one type of palm tree. So here you have a forest with different trees and animals and insects and flowers, and here you have just one tree. There's no diversity. The trees maybe don't feed or support many of the animals, and so when these grow, they're very sterile environments. Now, why are they growing palm trees? Because palm trees make palm oil, and palm oil is one of the most profitable oils used in not only cooking but manufacturing. So this is basically a plantation of trees, and it's not something that is used in Indonesia to an extent, but it is a major export crop. Because they're part of the global economic market, they're converting their rainforest into tree farms. And then lastly, war. Um, if you are fighting people, the last thing you're going to worry about is, oh no, we cut down that tree, or oh no, we burnt down that field. This right here is from Vietnam. During the Vietnam War in the 1970s, the U.S. government would fly over large areas of the jungle where North Vietnamese soldiers would hide. In order to make it easier, they would spray what's called Agent Orange, which is a chemical that kills all living plants, as you can see right here. Well, the issue with that is when you spray something that kills plants, it doesn't just go away. It gets into the soil, it gets into people, and this problem is a lingering issue. But that's obviously land that is no longer in prime shape. Right, I'm going to pause right here. This is a chance for me to have another drink of tea, for you to get up, Skype your friends and tell them how much you love environmental science, and then be prepared for the next section. So we're going to stop part one here, and I'll see you in part two.